Hi, I'm Dr Ursula Hackett, author of Brilliant Essays, your practical guide for university essay writing success. Welcome to my special video series on dissertation writing. This video offers some advice about structuring your dissertation. A dissertation is not just a very long essay. It's an independent piece of original research for which you craft your own research question. It often involves collecting and analysing data, unless you're working on a theoretical dissertation. And it needs to be written in distinct sections rather than all in one go. You can't just write a dissertation from start to finish on the eve of the deadline. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Let's walk through the different sections of a typical dissertation. The caveat: not every dissertation will necessarily follow the structure I'm going to lay out here. This is your own original piece of research, and an interpretivist or theory dissertation might take a different approach. So I'd advise you to discuss your dissertation plans with your supervisor. But here's a structure that works for many student dissertations. You introduce your research question in your introduction. Then you suggest an answer and derive some hypotheses in your literature review. You explain how you will test that answer in your methodology section. Then you actually test that answer in your data and results section. Finally, you identify the broader implications of your answer in the conclusion. Let's take each one in turn. First, your introduction. What is your research question? Write it out clearly, as early in your dissertation as possible, so that your reader's in no doubt about what you're asking. Perhaps you have some sub-questions, in which case you should also identify them briefly here. Tell your reader why your research question is important. What is distinctive about this question? Why are you doing this research? Briefly, state what you think you might find. What are your expectations? Finally, give your reader an outline map showing the sequence of chapters which they can follow, so they know at every stage what you will be doing and why. For instance, let's imagine you are asking the question, is veganism a form of political participation? You would also want to identify your sub-questions. What motivates people to live vegan? What do they wish to achieve by living vegan? In what other forms of political engagement are they active? Then you'd elaborate on the importance of this question and its intellectual significance, perhaps by considering how many vegans there are around the world and the relationships between animal rights activists and food bloggers or celebrities in promoting veganism. You might want to explain how your research would contribute to academic debates about unconventional forms of political participation, social movements, motivations for action, and the politicization of everyday actions. All of these points would underline the intellectual significance of your dissertation. Next, there's your literature review, in which you consider how other scholars have addressed your question, or similar questions. Obviously, they're unlikely to have addressed precisely the same question, but there will be allied ones. You should guide your reader authoritatively through your literature review by identifying the different approaches and answers and considering different aspects of the problems you're addressing. Where do scholars agree and disagree? What is missing from the literature? Next, you explain your own contribution to this literature. So you'll situate yourself within this scholarly conversation. What gap in the literature are you filling? Set out your expectations about what you'll find, your hypotheses, and use the literature to justify and explain your hypotheses. For example, in our Is Veganism a Form of Political Participation dissertation, you might identify 4 key concerns discussed in the scholarly literature, some of which seem political and others less so. Animal cruelty, greenhouse gases, world hunger, and the desire to improve one's health. There's disagreement about the extent to which veganism is a political statement versus a trendy lifestyle choice, and about its political effects. And the literature makes several conceptual distinctions between strict and moderate vegans and conventional and unconventional forms of political participation. These terms should be defined clearly as soon as they're introduced in the text. This study involves adjudicating disputes in the literature regarding motivations and political effects. Then the hypotheses flow from this discussion of the literature. For instance, you might expect that most vegans adopt the lifestyle for political reasons, especially the desire to reduce animal suffering, and that politically motivated vegans are more likely to practice strict veganism with no exceptions. The next section is the methodology section. This should be reasonably straightforward to write as long as you've planned everything out carefully. You describe and justify your method, and in the process demonstrate sound working knowledge of appropriate methods, techniques, and instruments. What research choices did you make? How did your method help you to answer your research question? You might refer to methods used by other scholars from your literature review. For example, The veganism dissertation would describe the survey you're using to investigate the research questions. You'd want to discuss practical difficulties involved in gaining a representative sample, the various sampling methods employed, and how you mitigate against the possibility of selection bias. You'll want to describe how the survey was conducted, the N, and the statistical techniques used to analyse the data. Next, it's your data and results section. You should describe your data. How was it collected? Help your readers visualise your data clearly through verbal description, charts, graphs, tables and figures as appropriate. Ensure all graphs and figures are properly labelled. This is a section where you tell your reader your main findings. Show how your research answers your question and any sub-questions. Were your hypotheses confirmed or disconfirmed? To what extent does your data support your propositions? How confident are you in your results? What limitations were there to your research that might affect the strength of your results? For example, in our veganism dissertation, you might include tables of descriptive statistics and graphs comparing vegans and non-vegans and disaggregating motivations. You should discuss any limitations of the study regarding the size and the representativeness of the sample, but the main findings should be crystal clear to the reader. The majority of vegans are politically motivated, and veganism is an unconventional form of political participation. In your final conclusion section, don't just repeat your findings again at length. If you've identified your findings clearly in the results section, then the reader doesn't need yet another lengthy rehash. Instead, ask yourself, what are the implications of my findings for the scholarly literature, for fresh empirical cases, and for the field as a whole? This is a student dissertation, not a large-scale, expensive, multi-year study, so inevitably there'll be some limitations, as there are in any small-scale research project. Be open about the limitations of your study and consider what new research questions your work prompts. The conclusion is the place to consider any recommendations that arise from your project and avenues for further investigation. Let's return to our veganism example one last time. The conclusion section might emphasise the growing body of research showing that everyday activities are becoming increasingly politicised and how this dissertation contributes to discussion of political participation. It might also consider practical lessons for promotion of vegan diet and potential uses of these findings by the vegan movement or the food industry. You should be open about the generalisability of these results and consider further questions about the extent of vegan engagement in other political activities for future work in this area. So there we have it. If you stick to this structure, introduction, literature review, methodology, data and results, and conclusion, then you won't go far wrong. There's no need to write them all in sequence, but you'll certainly need to write each section separately. Once you've got your first draft down, it's all in the editing. Good luck!